Welcome to Tactical Talk. This is Zain Khan. Today the topic of our show is, could the growing ties between Jerusalem and Moscow damage Kremlin's relationship with Tehran? Today the guest of our show is Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, who is the editor-in-chief of the British news magazine Politics First. Welcome to our show, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. This is Zain Khan. It's a pleasure to have you on Tactical Talk.
Thank you very much for having me back on.
Dr. Marcus, let's get to the first question. Ties between Moscow and Israel have been getting really cozy recently. Is this an analysis or a fact, in your opinion?
Let me first of all set the scene. Moscow's relationship with Israel has gone through many phases since 1948, and those phases have included some very radical changes. In 1948, the Soviet Union was a very strong supporter of the establishment of the State of Israel. Why? Because Moscow then believed that the creation of a Jewish state would mark the beginning of the end of British colonialism in that part of the Middle East. And indeed, Stalin supported the various Jewish groups who had been fighting the British army to form the state of Israel. And the Soviet Union in 1948 was one of the first countries in the world to recognize Israel. And it should also be said that the Russians, or to be more accurate, the Soviets, believed that given the experiences of the Jews in the Second World War, namely the Holocaust, that it was only right that the Jews should have their own state. So the initial relationship was positive. However, following 1948, and as a result of the numerous Arab-Israeli wars, the Soviet Union began to change its position on Israel. It certainly wasn't calling for the dismantlement of the Israeli state, but the Soviets were referring to Israel as being an expansionist power. And following the Six-Day War, the Soviets actually severed diplomatic relations with Israel. The Soviets made it very clear that for relations to be re-established between Moscow and Tel Aviv, Israel would have to relinquish Arab land, i.e. the land of the Palestinians and, of course, the Golan Heights. Now, that was a mistake that the Soviet Union made in severing relations with Israel. Indeed, Andrei Gromyko, the Soviet foreign minister at the time and the greatest foreign minister that Russia's ever had, said so in his memoirs that it was a mistake. So that was the second phase. The third phase took hold in 1991 and 1992, to be more specific, because at the beginning of 1992, the Soviet Union was no longer. The new Russia, which had emerged, the Russian Federation, quickly re-established relations with Israel. Now, why was that? Well, there are numerous reasons for the re-establishment of relations with Israel by the Russians. One of the factors is that many of the people around Boris Yeltsin, the oligarchs, had very close ties to Israel, and they were influencing Mr. Yeltsin in making sure that this new Russia would have a positive relationship with Israel. And so the current Israeli-Russian relationship is a positive one. It is a cordial one. There are strong economic ties between both countries. There are even stronger cultural ties. When Mr. Putin took over from Mr. Yeltsin at the end of 1999, a number of conditions had to be met by Mr. Putin for becoming president. One of them was that Yeltsin and his family would be immune from prosecution. One of the other conditions was that Mr. Putin would preserve the relationship with Israel, and Mr. Putin has done that. So that takes us to 2018. The relationship between Russia and Israel, I would use the word, is strong, relatively speaking. But of course, Russia's relationship with Syria is much stronger, and Russia's relationship with Tehran is stronger than its relationship with Israel.
Dr. Marcus, does the close ties between Russia and Israel recently affect on Kremlin's relationship with Tehran?
Yes, I do sympathise with that. Whilst I believe it is correct for there to be diplomatic relations between Moscow and Tel Aviv, nonetheless, I do not believe that the current relationship between Russia and Israel is the correct one from a Russian perspective. I do not believe that Russia as a whole benefits from its relationship with Israel. Indeed, I believe it sends the wrong message to Russia's real friends and allies in the Middle East and in North Africa. We must remember that Israel is, after the United Kingdom, America's most important friend and ally in the world. Israel is America's eyes and ears in the Middle East, like Syria is Russia's eyes and ears in the Middle East. But by Russia having this, relatively speaking, close relationship with Israel, which involves Russia not wanting to sell the S-300 system to Syria because of Israeli objections, sends, in my opinion, almost a two-faced impression of Russia to countries in the region, because people in Iran will be thinking, yes, we have a very strong relationship with Israel, with Russia, economically speaking, militarily speaking, scientifically speaking, in terms of engineering projects that the Russians are overseeing in Iran. But nonetheless, Russia does seem to give a lot of ground to Israel, and Iranians would be justified in feeling, well, if push comes to shove, would Russia come to the aid of us in a conflict with Iran? Because we know the Americans, for all their faults, would come to the aid of Israel no matter what. The Americans wouldn't allow any country to fire a single bullet or a cruise missile at Israel. Now, does Russia allow Israel to attack Syria in Damascus or in Homs, for example? Yes, they do. But to be fair to the Russians, that even happened in Soviet times. So whilst I do believe it's important for there to be diplomatic relations between Russia and Israel, it is far too close for my liking. And I would say this as well. The vast majority of Russian officials who I have spoken with privately have expressed the view that they do not agree with the policy of their government, of the Russian state, in regard to Israel.
Okay, let's get to a very important question. Some say Russia and Israel have some sort of a deal, and it's clear. Iran away from Israel's borders, and Assad's rule will be accepted. Is this a rumor or is it true?
There's no question or doubt in my mind that there are private talks going on between Israel and Russia regarding Iranian military personnel in Syria. And of course, that is a point of contention for both powers. And that is why this relationship between Israel and Russia, which has been very cordial, very positive since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, is starting to experience problems. And of course, Iran, we could say, is at the center of that, along with Syria, because the Russians have made it very clear that their relationship with Iran will not be affected by anyone, including Israel. And the Russians have made it very clear that the Iranian forces or the Iranian military personnel in Syria is essential in the fight against Wahhabist terrorism in that country. Now, Russia will also be saying to Iran, if we are going to limit Israeli military action in Syria, we can't give the Israelis ammunition, i.e., if limiting Israeli actions in Syria means making sure that there are no Iranian military personnel in the Quneitra province, close to the occupied Golan Heights, then the Russians will say to the Iranians, we think it's only prudent for Syria's sake. So I do believe that the fact that the Iranian military do not have a presence in Quneitra really is down to the Russians saying to the Israelis that we will use our influence with our Iranian friends to ensure there are no Iranian military personnel there, and therefore you have no reason to strike Syrian army formations in the Quneitra province. And I do believe, as I said, that Tehran is being told by Moscow what Moscow more or less is discussing with Israel. The Russian relationship with Israel, in my opinion, is untenable in the long term, because what we have seen emerge in recent years, in the last 3 years, is an unofficial relationship comprising Russia, Syria and Iran. And it's only inevitable that that unofficial relationship is sooner or later going to face off against another unofficial relationship in the Middle East, which comprises America, Israel and Saudi Arabia. So yes, relations between Russia and Israel are cordial, they are quite extensive. For just how long will they remain that way? My own opinion is that they won't remain as cordial as they have been since 1992.
Dr. Marcus, let's get to the last question and the most important question. Would Russia change its policies in the Middle East due to its recent developing relationship with Israel?
No, is the simple answer to your question. Under no circumstances will that happen. The Israelis made it very clear to the Russians they weren't happy, but the Russians told the Israelis, you're going to have to accept it, because coming to the aid of Syria is extremely important for the security and stability of the Middle East, and it's extremely important for Russian national security and for Russian influence and power in the Middle East. Let us not forget that a core reason as to why the Americans and their regional allies have attempted to overthrow the Syrian government is because by overthrowing the Syrian government, that would end Russia's influence and power in the Middle East. Because as I said earlier, Syria is Russia's eyes and ears in that region. Now, as a result of Russian military intervention in Syria and how incredibly successful it has been, Russia has returned to the Middle East in a very resurgent way. And Russia is back in vogue in the Middle East, like how it was for a good time of the 1950s, certainly in the 1960s, in the 1970s and the 1980s. And Russia will not allow anything to jeopardize its new position in the Middle East. And that is another reason why the relationship between Russia and Israel is already experiencing tension, because the Israelis ideally would have liked the Syrian government to be overthrown, because if the Syrian government was overthrown, then Israel would lose its archenemy. Iran would become an extremely weakened force in the Middle East, and Hezbollah would eventually become a spent force. But because of Russian military intervention in Syria, Hezbollah will remain a very strong force. Syria will become an even stronger country, and Iranian influence in the Middle East is on the rise now. So politicians in Israel, whilst paying lip service to the importance of Israel's relationship with Russia, privately, I suspect they will be saying very different things.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, for being on Tactical Talk. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you very much for having me on. I enjoyed that.
This was Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, the editor-in-chief of the British news magazine Politics. First, we were discussing, could the growing ties between Jerusalem and Moscow damage Kremlin's relationship with Tehran? Until the next episode of Tactical Talk, this is Zan Khan. Take care and goodbye.